Okay, looks like we've got a lot of attendees, which is wonderful. Thank you all so much for joining us. For those of you that don't know me, I'm David Becker. I'm the Executive Director and founder of the nonpartisan nonprofit Center for Election Innovation and Research based in Washington. And we work with you all, with the election officials all around the country, as you provide elections that voters should trust and do trust. In the course, of course, the last 4 years or so, election officials have experienced unprecedented challenges and sometimes abuse and harassment. And in response to that, in 2021, CEIR started the Election Official Legal Defense Network, or EOLDN for short, which you can find more information on at EOLDN.org. The co-chairs who really came up with this idea are Bob Bauer, former counsel to President Obama, and Ben Ginsberg, former campaign counsel to President George W. Bush and Mitt Romney. We wanted to provide a resource that election officials could turn to at no cost to themselves so they could get advice or assistance on any matter that they were experiencing, new things that they had never experienced before. And so we've been providing pro bono, at no cost, legal assistance to election officials all over the country for the last nearly 3 years. Sadly, the request and need for that assistance is as high now as it was in 2021 when we founded EOLDN. Since we started EOLDN in 2021, though, we heard from election officials that they were also having challenges with aspects of communication, that they were being challenged on issues related to their duties and how elections were run, and they wanted to be as transparent and communicative as possible. And so we started another aspect of EOLDN, which provided communications assistance to election officials whenever they needed it. If you go to EOLDN.org, you can actually request specific communications assistance for you and your election officials in your jurisdiction. But we also wanted to go a little farther, and we partnered with our good friends at CGCN, a great communications firm led in part by Matt Rhodes, Mitt Romney's former campaign manager in 2012. And we're going to be doing a series of webinars that provide some guidance on best communications practices in addition to the specific communications assistance that EOLDN offers. With that, I'm going to hand it off to Tracy Schmidt of CGCN, and she's going to take it from here. Thank you so much, Tracy.
Thank you, David, and thank you for letting us lead this. We're really excited to engage with you all on what we agree is really critical, critical work. Just a little introduction of myself and why I've got a little experience in this field. I've worked for 20 years, basically the intersection of media, politics, some policy. I was a spokesperson on 2 presidential elections, worked at the White House, and was the National Press Secretary at the Republican National Committee. Joining me is Matt Hartwig, one of my esteemed colleagues who has also worked at the DNC, worked for Senator Harkin, and ran communications for a handful of corporations. So between the two of us, we've got probably more experience in dealing with the media than we care to remember or admit. And we'll go ahead and kick this off. So most of you have, are really experts in your field, and you have dealt with kind of the ins and outs of election law and campaign issues far beyond election day, and far beyond those really kind of milestones that mark an election. So a lot of kind of speaking about what you do and speaking about the intricacies of it is something you could do in your sleep. Media, however, especially local media, which I think the bulk of you are going to be taking kind of fielding questions from local media, they haven't had that luxury. Any given day, any given news cycle, they could be covering a car chase, a local robbery, layoffs in a manufacturing plant, and then potentially an election law issue or a campaign story or a recount. So they don't have the luxury and they don't have the benefit of really kind of understanding the lay of the land. They often, and particularly, I feel like in the last few years, the business of media hasn't necessarily been a lucrative one, so they're short-staffed. They don't have the luxury of really taking time and doing research and really kind of understanding that not only the jargon, but the dynamics and all of kind of those critical pieces of the puzzle that are needed to produce often an accurate story. This can serve to your advantage, and that you can be a really important and critical source for them, especially if you kind of follow some of the principles that we're going to outline a little bit later. But this can also be tricky because they are probably the squeakiest wheel gets the attention. So they're really malleable to third parties trying to influence them because they don't necessarily have a lot of time. And I wouldn't say reporters are lazy, but they're really under pressure. So they need to crank these stories out quickly. And there's a lot of competition in being first. So this makes it kind of all the more important that you have the right tools in your toolbox to engage with them in a way that's effective and efficient and will ultimately help you drive that kind of desired narrative and instill confidence in the electorate. And today we're going to go through kind of some of these key principles in engaging with the media. I think it's something that is not kind of in your job description per se, but at least having like a basic understanding of how the media works, what their motivations are, some of these kind of critical tactics that you can utilize when you're talking to them or when you're even thinking about how you approach a conversation, why those are so important to the success in your role. We're going to speak a little bit about that, speak a little specifically to some of these tactics, and Matt will get into some more of that and provide some examples that can be useful to you. And then also leave some time for Q&A. And we really encourage anyone to ask sort of whole gamut of questions and, really leverage us while we're here on this call. So why is media so important? Again, like you all have really full, busy day jobs. Even if you take kind of media out of the piece, everybody's busy after hours. I realize really few of you have truly 9 to 5 jobs, but this is as I said before, the most probably important thing that's not necessarily on your job description, because how the electorate, considers and perceives whether, the election system is fair and whether it's secure and whether it's something that they want to participate in, that they have confidence in. That really is based off, candidly, like what they see and hear in the media and how reporters approach these stories. So it's really critical that you can come to the table and be armed with kind of all those possible tools for success. But just touching on a few key principles, being early. And by this, I think we also mean being proactive and really like understanding whether or not like a reporter comes to you at the beginning of their reporting or whether they come to you at the end when they've got 30 minutes under deadline. That can make a great impact on the outcome and on the accuracy and on the tone of the story. So some of this is being early and really being like kind of getting in there, but also having those relationships and kind of you driving the narrative and understanding that when it comes to the media, you're ultimately in the driver's seat. So it's important to kind of begin that engagement early in the election cycle. And this isn't just something that's like about, you all know, it's not about that one day. It's about starting a dialogue with the media as soon as possible and kind of forming some of these relationships so they can view you as a source. And when it comes to viewing you as a source, you certainly want to be viewed as a credible source. And that's why being prepared is so important. Thinking about kind of what you want to say, and this goes into our third principle as well, but also knowing that if the media kind of thinks, okay, maybe you don't have a full grasp of the issues and really don't like a full handling of the facts, like they may convey you in the story in a way that is less than favorable, or they may not call you at all next time, and they may go to somebody that's less credible, and then you really are at a loss if you can't even get in the story. So really being early, being prepared, having all of your facts straight, which I know kind of everyone does, but when you're talking to the media, if you haven't really thought it through, you might find yourself kind of stumbling and flat-footed. But also being clear on your desired outcome. The most dangerous thing someone can do, even if they're very confident in their day job, but if they haven't really thought through what their desired outcome is with the reporter, just hopping on the phone to gab with the reporter or see what they have to say, but not really thinking about what you want out of the conversation and what you want the outcome to be, is a very dangerous thing. Let me go to the next slide. Does this hop to the next slide?
Are you not seeing it, Tracy?
I'm not. Are we on the next? Okay, there we go. So going back to kind of being early, meeting the media where they are and really understanding what drives the media. Because in this particular era, when there is so much competition in terms of forms of new media, and we all know social media, whether or not it should be a
Sorry, everyone. It looks, oh, here she comes. Here's Tracy.
Huh, I lost you all.
Yes, we lost you.
Can you share the slide again, Matt?
Yes, I'm bringing it up right now.
Please, Matt, too. Wonder if we're having technical.
Yes.
So because of all the competition and because the media is under such heat from a business perspective, being like timeliness and getting them something first, and whether or not something is new and relevant and not kind of old news, as they say, is all the more important. An event must be current, or it must be maybe something that they haven't seen before. Even better than current is if giving them a heads up about something that is going to happen potentially in the future, and giving them maybe a chance at an exclusive is something. And we can, I think in this kind of series of training, we're going to get into a little bit, flesh a little bit more of this out. But proximity, is this relevant to their reader? Is it close both like physically, and is it something that's top of mind? Trends, often media likes to cover things that are happening in threes. And if they look for something and they see something that keeps happening in the national media, they will look for ways to make it relevant and make it timely to their audience. So in other words, if there's something that is being covered on CNN and you can find, and that's a desired narrative for you, and you can find like a local angle, that's absolutely something that will be of interest to them. And some of this is not only of like interest to the reporters, but gives their editors kind of air cover to agree and let them cover something. Change an event that is new or different, but conflict. They say if it kind of leads or leads, if it bleeds, it leads. Unfortunately, again, this can sometimes work in your favor, but reporters tend to care about conflict. And we know because I mean, it's human nature, and readers and viewers are kind of drawn to conflict, unfortunately. Obviously, prominence, something that taps in or mentions somebody that's well known, whether it's people or business. This is whether it's, people, business a little less relevant to this audience, but people, and useful. So if you are able to, and this goes back to what we were saying about reporters not having the luxury of being kind of experts in their field, there just isn't the money for reporters to have beats per se, right? So they could be covering, they could be covering something that's completely out of, not related to elections at all, and the next day they could be thrown into this. So to the extent you can be seen as someone that educates them, it's incredibly useful. And obviously a surprise. If the local news were ho-hum, nobody would watch it. So these are kind of a few things to think about, not only in terms of thinking about, is there anything proactively that we can give or we can use to kind of start this dialogue with the media, but also what's going to be of interest to them. So when I think about the messaging, when we think about how we approach these subjects, we can do so in a way that's going to be effective for them. And this goes back to preparation and doing your homework. Knowing your audience, who your primary audience is probably like one of the key things, and speaking to that audience in a language that they understand. And I think sometimes people tend to just think in a box and think, oh, well, I'm talking to the reporter, so the reporter's my audience. The reporter is never your ultimate audience. You're trying to reach, obviously, the electorate and the voters and find ways to kind of and continue to instill confidence in them. So figuring out, is this a particular segment of that population and sometimes the publication will tell you, given now we have publications that are considered more left of center, more right of center, some on the fringe, unfortunately, and some right in the middle, that can help to inform you in terms of who your audience is. What is your reporter's experience with the issue? Is this one of those instances where the reporter will have a lot of experience and has been covering this for a while? Again, sometimes this can work to your advantage, not always, because you usually want to be the one that is armed with the most knowledge on in the conversation. But what type of story is it? And that's something you can usually figure out, whether it is a kind of feature local reporter. If it's an investigative reporter, that tells a very different story. And that's something you really want to kind of approach with care and be ultra cautious in your dealings with investigative reporters. Where is your point of view going to fit in? Are they looking for you to be the antagonist in the piece? Are they looking for you to be the kind of the voice of reason and really sort of driving this story? Or are they looking at you maybe like as a expert, as a third party, and maybe the story isn't necessarily under your purview, but it's something where you can weigh in and really provide context, and gives you kind of a different roadmap than you might have otherwise. And what are their likely questions? Typically, if obviously all of you are experts in your field, if you know what the story is going to be about, you can usually figure out those questions in advance, or at least think about them and think, what are the basic ways that I would answer this question? And we may speak a little bit more to this, but something that's really important is knowing that, like, it's not necessarily your job to answer the specific question directly. You can answer the topic rather than the question, because it's your message. And this will go to the next slide, but it's your, 1 to 3 top messages that you're trying to communicate. So finding a way to communicate those, even if the question is something that's very specific and not something that you want to answer. And the next slide, if we can. Okay. It's really important that you're clear on what you want to say. And it's not, the reporter might have a whole list of questions, but that may, and more often than not, that is not aligned with what you are looking to drive, right? And what you would like the message to be at the end of the day. It may be in certain instances, but your talking points, while they should speak in general to the topic at hand and not be completely off what they're trying to talk about, because then you lose credibility. You're not seen as a source. You're seen as someone that has an agenda of your own. So really, it's a bit of an art here. It's not necessarily black and white. So you're conveying those messages that you want the audience to hear, but you're also addressing the reporter's kind of general inquiries. These should be very kind of straightforward and concise, and understanding, and Matt will speak to this a little bit more, but like understanding that the reporters likely don't understand the jargon and the technical, but the readers most definitely don't. So speaking in very kind of clear and concise terms that are digestible to the lay person, which may be counterintuitive to what you all do every day, especially kind of if you're in the legal field, but thinking through how the kind of average Joe, if you will, is going to receive and digest this information. I think 3 core messages are fine. Like, if you have to go 4, no more than 5. You lose people at 5. And candidly, you're not going to get, this isn't an op-ed. You're going to get 1 quote, maybe 2 quotes in the story, or 1 soundbite in the news piece. So pick your most important messages and lead with those. I think often, and we advise clients on this pretty frequently, they're like, yes, but I also want to have this, and I also want to have that. And I fear of not having every single element in the quote. Well, unfortunately, you don't have that luxury. And if you give too much information, you're really handing the keys over to the reporter to decide what's important. So it's up to you to pick the most important messages that you want to convey, and make sure that you maybe just only convey those. Again, having facts and examples, having concrete pieces to support your messaging, doing your research. Sometimes just by Googling a reporter's name, it's as simple as that. It takes 30 seconds, but it can be an infinite wealth of information in terms of whether the reporter is well-versed on this issue, if they have an agenda, what their coverage has been about this, who their other sources may be. Look, reporters don't have time, particularly if they're not a beat reporter, to be constantly going out, making new and additional sources, in the kind of local election landscape. So if you can tell that they've quoted someone else a few other times, it's likely that that's going to be one of their sources. And that may in itself be a little bit of a roadmap in terms of what they're trying to cover. Be confident, credible, and enthusiastic. Actually, I think people, and while it's important to be cautious, tend to view communicating with the media as always on defense and, just get in, get out. But it's really important you view it as an opportunity, and you approach it that way. And your body language and your voice, your confidence and your enthusiasm sends that kind of subliminal message to the reporter that you're credible, you're confident, and, you're going to help them with their story. But you also, ultimately aren't going to, they're not going to be able to boss you around, if you will. And this kind of, it goes back to being in control, having that message discipline, having those three pieces. And Matt will speak to this more, but even if you have to say the same two messages 4 different ways, you might annoy the reporter, but it's definitely, while it's great to be a good source and likable, it's not your job to be friends with the reporter or make the reporter happy or appease them. It's your job to get out your desired narrative and get that piece not only accurate, but compelling to your end. But again, it doesn't hurt to be helpful, have other idea on angles, often other ideas on interviewees. There may be things that you're not comfortable saying, and it's not really appropriate for you in your official role capacity to be giving that message. But maybe an outside election attorney or a third party that would be the absolute right voice to give that message. So it's totally acceptable, and they appreciate it for you to suggest other voices that the reporter should talk to. And with that, we're going to dive a little bit deeper. I'm going to turn it over to Matt to speak a little bit more about these specific techniques.
Thanks, Tracy, and sorry about that technical glitch. Real life example of the things you just have to prepare for if you're going to be doing an interview over Zoom, for example. Tracy did a great job of talking about the importance of preparation as you lead into the interview. You've done your homework. You agree this is a good thing to do, or you get caught coming out of an event where press are going to be in attendance. They ask for a quote or a comment following an event. We'll go through some best practices, some techniques you can use to get in and out of sticky questions, but also, I think most importantly, make sure the message you want delivered is the message that gets heard. If you can move to the next slide. We've all heard the fail to plan, plan to fail. Going into an interview, you should have a plan. It doesn't have to be extensive. You don't have to have every answer to every possible question mapped out ahead of time and memorized. But you do need to think about how you want it to go, how you're going to approach it, what you want out of it. And remember that an interview kind of has 4 parts. You have that intro part where you're setting the tone. It's the, man, today was busy, or you should have seen what just happened on the Zoom call I was part of, right? There are a number of ways for you to engage with the reporter in a way that personalizes the relationship, gets everyone relaxed and comfortable. You should also be clear on the story angle, right? This is what we agreed to talk about per the discussion and what the ground rules are. What we're sharing here today is really about interviews that are on the record, where everything that you say is going to be recorded and possibly quoted. But there are other ways that an interview may go down, and you want to be clear on the rules of engagement before you go in. And finally, before it starts, just be clear. I'm here to talk about the election integrity, in your jurisdiction. This is what we're here to talk about. Moving into the interview, you can also be the one who leads it. You don't have to rely on the reporter to pull answers out of you. Rather, you can drive them and steer them in the direction that you want to go. You want to be quotable. You want to speak in headlines. As Tracy talked about, local reporters, who maybe aren't versed in the ins and outs of what you all do. You want to provide them a good quality soundbite or two that they can cut up and put on their newscast, right? You want that, they want that. You also want to use the techniques that we'll talk about in a little bit about hooking and bridging and blocking to help you manage questions that maybe you don't know the answer to, maybe that you're not comfortable answering, but there are ways for you to redirect that question back onto more solid ground for you. And then you also want to listen to the questions as they're asking. Maybe you can pick up a theme, but you don't want to get trapped and so into your own answers that you give them an answer that completely misses the question that they asked and isn't relevant. So you want to be attention and listen to what they're asking you. You will get a chance at the end of every interview, most likely, where the interviewee or the reporter will say, "Is there anything else that you would like to add?" Here's your chance to come back to those 3 messages that you've decided are the core messages you want to convey and reiterate them one more time. I will tell you more often than probably not, those are the quotes that get used because you will have had some time to get them out, to work through them, say them 2 or 3 times over the course of the interview. So when you get to the end, they are concise and on point, and oftentimes that's what people are going to use. And as Tracy said, you want to be helpful, right? You want to share, oh, have you spoken to this expert on this topic? Or have you considered this angle for the story as you work on this? You know, again, it keeps that relationship warm. It keeps you as a credible source, you know, and it's important for you as well, because ultimately you want a good story and a good message out there around how the elections are being operated. So you're done, the interview is over. Stay in character. In particular, if there's a microphone and a camera. We've all seen the outtakes where people forget their microphone is live or the camera is rolling. So until that microphone is removed, the red light of the camera is off and they're putting it away, stay in your character. Don't wade into other observations you might have or something that is off topic. That's where people tend to get caught. And then be interested in what else they're writing, be a resource, follow up before and after the story publishes. It's all about relationship maintenance following the interview, and that can come in handy as well. They may come back to you to clarify a fact, to clarify a quote, you know, or if something is misquoted or mischaracterized, you know, you've laid the groundwork in that relationship, so you can go back to them and hopefully get that issue corrected. You can go on to the next slide. So we talked about this. Don't bury the lead. Speak in headlines. 90% of what most of these reporters want is something that they can quote, that is pithy, that is punchy, and most importantly, that people can relate to, that people can understand. A couple of relevant facts can be useful. They can support the headlines that you're talking about. Perhaps it's the number of voters that you have removed from rolls because you determined them to be ineligible. You've done your due diligence managing those lists. And this has been the result of it. Or it could be, you know, big number dollar investments that you put into election security and other physical security around polling sites. Anything that adds color but doesn't get too deep into the weeds. It will be rare that you have an opportunity to get down into that add minor details part of the pyramid, you know, because those are reserved for more of those long form opportunities. You know, NPRs and local public radio tend to offer you a little bit longer opportunity. A podcast is another type of interview where you'll have an opportunity to say a bit more about the topic. But, you know, unless it's sort of in that setting, keep to your headlines, keep to your core messages, and don't be afraid to repeat them. So we talked about being in control and those techniques that you can use. Here are 3 of them that you've probably heard. Some people call them different things, but the idea of hooking is leading the reporter to ask a question that you want to answer, and we'll give you an example of how that might work. Bridging, we've heard, right? It's the I don't know the answer to that, but what I can tell you is moment that we see in press conferences all the time, and it's very useful to steer the conversation back to where you want it to be. And flagging is simply just letting the reporter know that you think these are the really important things that they need to include in their article because their readers, their listeners, their viewers need to hear those. And we can get into some of the specific examples for each. So hooking, so you want to address a question. You never want to just completely blow them off, but you don't have to answer it sort of directly or in the way that it was asked. And the key to a good hook to bring out the next question is lead them into what should be the follow-up question, right? As we talked about, the integrity of our voter list is just one aspect of how we ensure elections are safe and secure. Well, can you elaborate? What are the other aspects of that? Actually, the second most important part of ours, that's the second most important part. Well, then what is the first, right? And it elicits out of them the questions that you want to answer. Maybe they're the questions that you prepared to answer. And it's a way for you to, one, keep control of the interview, but also give them something useful because they're just a channel. Remember, it's their audience that you want to hear this message. The next one is bridging, and again, it's the answering the questions, right? It's wild allegations that there's been massive voter fraud, or you'll get questions like this. Ways to answer it is, yeah, our election system is secure. And the bridge and the answer to that, or the reason for that, is significant investment or whatever it happens to be. Or no, these allegations misrepresent the facts. Let me explain how our voter registration works. And then you can go on to talk about something that you're more comfortable about that better aligns to the message you want to deliver. Another example might be you get asked about the practices or activities of somebody, of an election official in another jurisdiction, another state. It's fine to say you don't know exactly what they do off the top of their head, specifically, but you can talk about how they take their job seriously and all the things that you have in common, all of the various ways that you guys follow local law to make sure that voter rolls are accurate, that the vote is counted correctly, all of those things. You share some commonalities. But it's important to maybe avoid sort of getting into the weeds about which voting systems they use and stuff like that. It's just not your answer. You can pivot back to what you do in your jurisdiction. And then finally, the last one is flagging. It is fairly self-explanatory, but it's really, really important, right? You want to let the reporter know these are the statements, these are the issues we should be talking about, right? Words like importantly. The key takeaway is what I think you should remember. All of those will tip off the reporter if it's not live, but it's also will tip off the audience, right? If it's a live interview, if it's a speech, or they're taking that piece at the end, right? They ask you, is there anything else you want to say? You can come back to, well, what I want voters to remember is this, right? And that's a signal to everybody that these are the important things that they need to pay attention to. All right, last slide. I get the fun thing of going through the things you don't ever want to do in an interview. There aren't many, but there's some pretty big ones. The first one is don't lie. I know it seems simple, but don't lie. If you don't know the answer to something, don't make it up. It is okay to say, I don't know the answer, right? I'll get back to you. What I can tell you is, and you bridge to something that you want to do. I will tell you too, those of you who have staff that help you with those, having Tracy and I have done this a long time. If I hear somebody giving an interview and say, I don't know that answer off the top of my head, right? That's a flag to me as the staffer to pick up that question and follow up with the reporter and make sure they get the answer they need. As we talked about in some of the techniques, you don't need to feel like you have to answer the specific question. You can answer it on the general topic writ large. Don't ever assume you are ever off the record. Even if you've agreed to go off the record with the reporter, it's important to maintain the boundaries and the relationship. You each have a job to do, and you need to respect that and be mindful of that. Don't waste time discussing your detractors by name or repeating the negative. Move on to the points you want to make. Use the techniques you have, concentrate on the messages that you spent time developing and deliver those for the audience. In most cases, the reporters they might ask you a second time, can you address, so-and-so's allegation of X, right? I'm here to talk about what we're doing to make sure the votes in this jurisdiction count, right? So just don't take that bait. Don't over answer, respond, and then stop. Reporters, particularly print reporters, will use a pregnant pause to their advantage, hoping that you don't like silence. So you'll answer your question, you'll stop, and they'll pretend to scribble, or they'll just stand there and look at you, hoping you'll just keep talking. Feel comfortable just stopping and waiting for the next question if you've said what you need to say. Don't fixate on the question, bridge to the point, get in and out of those questions you don't like and back to your points. And finally, don't repeat a reporter's negative statements or slurs. You want to take the higher ground, be on the positive side, talk about what you are doing rather than to respond to allegations and things that you aren't.
Yeah, I'm gonna try and follow up with the do's and try my hardest not to add don'ts, but these all sort of work together. I know Matt did a great job with the don'ts, but knowing your key messages and being prepared, understand what you want to leave the reporter with, even if it requires you repeating things and it feels uncomfortable for you. Remember, for the most part, your conversation with the reporter or your full kind of on-camera interview is not what's going to be what ends up in the story or in the local news piece. So identifying those key messages and really kind of honing in on those. And to that end, speaking in the headlines first, don't bury the lead. Particularly assume that if you repeat something a few times, you may be able, even if it's not what the reporter necessarily wanted to hear to support their agenda, you may be able to work it into the story. So highlighting those key points and emphasizing what your agenda is because you've really taken some time and thought about it before you got on the phone. Communicate clearly. And this goes back to knowing your audience and avoiding jargon. What is clear as a bell to you as somebody with a lot of experience in election law or campaigns and elections in general may be clear as mud or downright confusing to the average layperson. So really thinking about how you can message things that are maybe a little more complicated in more simple terms that aren't jargon, that aren't acronyms. Acronyms completely, turn people off if you're on the TV, and the reporter may just discard all of that because they didn't really have the time to go back and ask you kind of what you meant. So it's really important to break it down into everyday speak. Using your facts and anecdotes, though, to demonstrate credibility and having kind of those data points is really important, especially in a, just candidly, it's a highly polarized environment. And it's, fair to assume that most people have a leaning one way or the other, and the reporter will think about that. Having facts and data points to point to will really sort of even that out and demonstrate credibility. Being engageable and likable, that's a very different thing than telling the reporter what they want to hear and filling in what they're looking to find out from their story. So you can, for many years in politics, I had reporters that I was friends with at the end of the day, but asked me questions that they knew I was not going to be able or want to answer, or be the right person to answer the question as well. And that's something else to keep in mind. You can always refer them to somebody else, but you can be likable and you can not give them information and do so with a smile. I think that's really important. And that goes along with keeping your cool. It's especially, you all have pretty intense day jobs. At the end of the day, talking to a reporter and calling folks back, this is like the last thing, a lot of you kind of want to be doing and will be seen as a burden. And the reporter, this is going to be seen as an extra stressor, right? And often these are around lawsuits or recounts or things that are stress inducing anyways. But to the extent you can avoid being provoked and keep your cool, will go a long way in preventing an absolute kind of unbearable sort of headline or story. You never want to be the story, right? You want it to be the messages that come out of your mouth. So keeping your cool goes a long way in doing that. I know that's kind of what we have from a prepared standpoint. What we'd like to do is open it up to questions and encourage kind of all of you to, if you've got anything you'd like us to dive in a little more, now's the time.
Yeah, we're getting a lot of great questions, so I can just jump right in and I'll direct them to you guys and you can take turns answering however you want to do it. So the first question we have is, what do you do if you sense it's a gotcha interview? And what do you do if you believe you've been misquoted?
Well, I think those are two different things. I think something that's a gotcha interview, sometimes if you do a little bit of research, you can know in advance, particularly if it's an investigative or the reporter has a paper trail of writing stories that are written in a certain angle or negative. You could probably know what you're getting into and be all the more careful and concise and crisp with your answers and keeping to the topic and not being pulled in to answer a question. Or, I think it's what I can say, and some of these techniques that Matt spoke about, you don't necessarily have to answer and you shouldn't answer that specific question. if you think you've been misquoted, I would absolutely, and why I think it's important, if you're being recorded by the reporter, you should also be recording on your end, right? So there's the he said, she said game, it doesn't really serve anyone well. So make sure that you've maybe got somebody there and you're not having these conversations when you are, like exhausted, or at the end of the day, you're really giving yourself like the home court advantage in terms of how it's going to turn out. But having said that, you absolutely can get misquoted because reporters are human, or they may have an agenda but we like to think that most journalists are, have integrity and are doing everything on the up and up. You absolutely have the ability to call that reporter. And if it's something that's factual and it's inaccurate, they sometimes will run a correction. That's the last thing they want to do. But it's worth kind of making that case if you feel like you were misquoted. It doesn't mean, sometimes you just get the short end of the stick, and they're not necessarily going to work with you. And then that's a reporter I'd put at the bottom of my pile in terms of returning their call again. I don't know, Matt, if you have anything to add to that, because that's an important question.
Yeah, that is a great question. And it happens too often. On the misquoting you, yes, record it. Even if it's an off the record conversation, they're recording, you should be as well. It's also good for you to go back and listen to it. It helps you refine your message. It helps with the practice and the prep. On the gotcha question, Tracy makes great points about the prep and the research before you ever agree to the interview. You don't always have to agree to the interview either. You can say, you know what, we're happy to answer questions over email and do it over writing. So you're still being responsive, but you're eliminating the element of human error, where you might say something or they may take you out of context. You have that paper trail. It doesn't always work, and the reporter, especially if it's a TV reporter or something like that, they may want an on-camera interview. But if you're uncomfortable doing that, that's another avenue open to you to be responsive and get your message out, as well as mitigating risk.
Yeah, absolutely agree, especially if you're new and dealing with the media and this is around something legal, or they will not be, that's never going to be their first choice, is that can you answer questions on email? But they're not going to be shocked if that's how you choose to set the ground rules. And I would encourage folks, particularly when the stakes are high and you're new at this, to maybe communicate some of these things over email. Protect yourself.
Okay, another question we have is, do you have advice for what happens if I misspeak?
So avoid misspeaking. If you misspeak and you have a relationship with her, I think it depends. If you've said something that's inaccurate, you're in a much better position, because they don't want to print something that's inaccurate, because that undermines their credibility. So you're then in a much better position to either, the sooner you can do it, usually maybe on the spot, or if you hang up and you realize you've given something that wasn't correct, or you want to is call them immediately and explain, you know what, I actually was wrong on that. Again, this is easier when it's something that's fact-based. If you were a little too, and transparent's the wrong word, but if you maybe said something that you wish you hadn't, it's a little bit trickier. If you have a good relationship with the reporter, it can't hurt to ask that you would prefer something was kept out of the story. That, though, also tends to be a little bit of a red flag. And then they can think, oh, I'm really onto something here. So the best possible thing to do is avoid that situation. And I would say less is more. It is not you, especially when you're first doing this, you are not the White House press secretary. You are not looking to, be a total hotshot with the media. I would just really keep it clean and keep it straightforward in terms of your dealing with them. I don't know, Matt, if you have any other thoughts.
Okay. How do you recommend dealing with requests from unfriendly media?
It depends on the publication. I think, unfortunately, what doesn't look great and what doesn't help anybody is if you just don't answer or don't engage. But I would say I would treat, in some ways, friendly media and unfriendly media the same way, because should never really, there is no really total such thing as completely friendly media, because at the end of the day, everyone has jobs to do. and they are looking for clicks and views and to get accolades for breaking some sort of news. So I would be pretty cautious with all media, but extra careful with those to be unfriendly.
Right, and keep in mind too that the audience is not the media outlet or the reporter.
Right.
Right,
Right.
it is the audience that listens and watches who needs this information as much as audience of a perceived friendly reporter. Right, so you have to keep that in mind. That's also where the written statement, again, they don't love them sometimes, but you're at least being responsive. It creates a paper trail in case you're concerned that they're gonna play some gotcha in some way, shape, or form. But being responsive, even just declining comment because it's a legal matter, or responding in some way, not completely stonewalling them and going silent is the best practice.
Yeah, and one thing I'd add to this is sometimes people, they think, okay, this reporter and this publication, and therefore this readership is not aligned with the messages we are trying to get out, and we know that they, have a beef with us anyway. In the way the media works, like news is news, so people go to Google, and whether or not people are going to read these stories, and they live in perpetuity, so it really doesn't, matter. I mean, of course, it's a little different if it's, the New York Times and something that you feel like is very, politically polarizing, and you're never going to win that audience. Well, that doesn't really matter because this is out there in the public domain and lives. So.
Okay. The next question is, I often find myself being forced to respond to false or misleading allegations relating to election officials' responsibilities, and I feel like I can't avoid sounding defensive or overly technical. Do you have any advice for me?
Think to the extent, and this I think where it goes back to keeping your cool, and I think it's fun, and I do think you should assume most things are on the record, but in terms of wanting to talk maybe on background with a reporter and explaining, like providing them the education about the technical piece, so you don't, and having that conversation, so it feels like it's a little more in layman's terms. In terms of sounding defensive, I think some of that is tone, and it's sometimes it's easier to do those over email, although emails can certainly come off snarky as well. But that's where you really have to kind of dig deep and keep your cool. And I'd love to say it's something I've succeeded in 10 out of 10 times, but look, we're all human. That's not the case.
Yeah, and this was when we talked about being early. This is where some of that early work comes in, right? If you've identified your universe of reporters who you're likely to engage with, reach out early, invite them in, show them how a voting machine works, explain how you do your job. So and unfortunately, I think it's an inevitability that they come to you and with not understanding or saying, well, I heard this, is that true? Some of those questions. That early work allows you to point back to, well, remember when you were here in our offices and we talked about that? That's how we do that. It requires a lot of work, and we recognize that media relations is not part of the job description, but it can pay dividends, especially in moments like that.
So we're getting a couple of questions about getting ready to defend the election results in November, and just, is there anything that they're sort of gearing up for, getting questions about people who are not accepting the election results? So I don't know if you all have any advice about preparing for that, and what some things that people can get ready to discuss for November.
I think obviously thinking through your messaging in advance is important, but probably, and this, this is probably pretty intuitive, but it should never be, especially in something like this that is going to be kind of potentially contentious, it should probably never be the first call or the first interaction with that reporter around election results. So establishing those kind of trusted relationships, so you have that credibility and you have that relationship with the reporter far in advance of the election, I think is really important. And then obviously working through some of that messaging in ways that we know is both fact-based and compelling is key.
Agreed, and that's a great tease, because I think one of our trainings is on crisis communications, and I think that very much qualifies as a crisis. Tracy's point about the early work and bring them in, that transparency, right? So they feel like they can come and see, the reporter can come and see what you're doing. You're not hiding anything, is a really important advantage to have with the reporter versus, you know, the camp that lost, saying they're not going to accept the election, you know, if they don't have any proof. The reporter has seen it with, you know, their own eyes. The only caveat I would put in there, and Tracy touched on this really early, is reporters love conflict. So they're still going to write that story because of the inherent conflict within it. So you probably can't ever win that argument, right? That the other side may not be persuadable. But I think it's important for you to keep your cool, come back, have your messages prepared. You can probably predict this is going to happen, and keep coming back to those same messages calmly and coolly, and hope that over time, you know, the fires die down.
Okay, another question is, when is it okay to say no comment or refuse to answer a reporter's questions?
Matt, I'm gonna kick this one to you. I about this earlier. You had a great answer.
Ideally, you want to provide them with something, right? There may be an instance, you know, where you can't comment. It might be litigation, right? And it's okay to say, because it's an ongoing case, you know, I can't comment on that. But what I can say is, and always have those core messages that you've developed at the ready, that you can pull out in sort of in any circumstance. I think if they're emailing you questions or asking for comment on a story, you know, over email or something like that, you can, you know, say, you know, I don't have a comment about this, but what I'd like to tell you is that. I think it's harder for you, especially if you're at an event and the reporter catches you coming out of an event, or, you know, everybody, maybe an element of this training that's important to include in the future is everybody's a journalist. We all carry a phone around. We are all journalists, whether we like it or not. And being able to say, you know, if someone shouts at you an allegation over voting fraud, right? For you to say, you know, look, I'm here today to talk about X, Y, and Z, whatever the topic is. Repeat your messages from that day and move on. You're acknowledging them. You just don't have to, you don't always have to answer the question exactly as it's posed to you.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think that's it for our questions. We do have, as Matt mentioned, we have a webinar coming up in September. There's also going to be one in July, and we can drop the link for that in the chat as well. But this is the first in a series, so we hope that you all are able to join for those. But I'm going to hand it back over to Tracy and Matt to finish up. So thank you.
Fantastic. I mean, that concludes it on our end, but we thank you all for joining us. And, you know, if there are questions that you didn't get answered or you think of later, you know, perhaps filter those through David and company. We'd love to continue this important conversation, because it's not, you know, a matter of if you're going to get these inquiries. It's really a question of when and how we can potentially be helpful to get you as prepared as possible.